Herkese günaydın ve hoş geldiniz Fiscaoeconomia'nın sosyal bilimler üzerine kongresine. Bugünkü kongrenin bu session'ında bir misafirimiz var. Andreas Nölke'ye, Almanya'dan, Goethe Üniversitesi'nden. Onu dinleyeceğiz ve muhtemelen de kitabı üzerine ya da kitabının bir takım çıkarımları üzerine konuşacak. Ben bu sunuşun moderasyonunu üstlenmiş durumdayım. İsterseniz öncelikle bir misafirimize bir resmi bir hoş geldiniz diyelim. Arkasından tekrar size dönelim ve sonrasında da misafirimizin konuşması için kendisine bir süre verelim. Andreas, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you well.
Okay. Hello again, and welcome to our meeting today. And my name is Mustafa Durmuş'a from a university in Ankara, based in Ankara. Actually, I myself expert in public finance, and I'm going to be moderate this session. So, in other words, I'm going to be your moderator today. So, probably you would like to start from the beginning about your subject. But I understand your main subject today is post-corona capitalism and the alternatives. And we're going to hear your alternatives, what sort of alternatives you are offering to us, because it's going to be a really, really big chapter in front of us. So I understand that we have in total an hour or so. So you might like to use this time as follows: 30 to 40 minutes for your presentation, and the rest could be the questions to be answered. And if you agree with me, let's take the questions in writing, and the audience and the listeners can type their questions in the chat box, and you can actually see them, and I can see them, then you can answer them. Would that be all right for you?
Absolutely.
Marvelous. Okay. Then let me introduce you to the audience in the first place in Turkish, and tell them about your works, and specifically about your latest book, Post-Corona Capitalism and the Alternatives. Değerli arkadaşlarım, Profesör Nölke'nin Mayıs ayının 2022'sinde, yani bu 2022 yılının Mayıs ayında bir kitabı çıktı. Kitabın adı da tam şöyle: Korona sonrası kapitalizm ve önümüzdeki alternatifler. Bristol Üniversitesi'nden yayınlandı bu kitap. Kitap 266 sayfalık bir kitap. Oldukça geniş kapsamlı. Hemen hemen korona sonrası tüm kapitalizmin şeylerini önüne almış durumda. Ana konularını önüne almış durumda. Giriş ve sonucuyla haricinde, giriş ve sonucu halinde 7 tane bölüm var. Çok kabaca bölümlerden size bahsetmek istiyorum. Çünkü önemli bu. Hem sunuşu daha iyi yakalayabilmek, kavrayabilmek açısından, hem de Nölke'nin aslında ne söylemek istediğini şahsen benim açımdan da kavrayabilmek açısından bu önemli. Girişte kapitalizmin çok boyutlu bir kriziyle yüzleşmek diye başlıyor. Yani çoklu krizler ya da çok boyutlu kapitalizmin krizi diye tanımlayabiliriz bunu. Ve birinci bölümde kapitalizm ve toplum diye bir şey var, kısım var. O kapitalizm ve toplum kısmında hem sağlık sistemlerini anlatıyor, sonra refah devletini anlatıyor. Refah devletinin bir restorasyon mu, yoksa örneğin evrensel temel gelir ya da Türkiye'de konuşulduğu gibi temel gelir güvencesi mi olarak anlaşılabileceği tartışmasına girmiş durumda. Sonrasında yeniden üretken iş pratikleri üzerine bir bölüm var. Cinsiyetli meslekler üzerinden toplumsal cinsiyete duyarlı meslekler ya da iş kalıplarına yer ayırdığı bir bölüm var. Göç bölümü var. Kapalı sınırlar ya da açık kapılar altında. Tabii ki bu bölümde yine eşitsizlikler, hem küresel hem de ülkeler içerisindeki eşitsizlikler artıyor mu, azalıyor mu diye bir bölüm var. Bu birinci bölüm. İkinci bölümünde kapitalizmin talep yönlü ulusal ya da yerel kurumlarından söz ediyor. Burada para politikasından bahsediyor. Para politikasının demokratik ya da teknokratik olup olmadığını sözünü ediyor. Sonra maliye politikası. Burada maliye politikasına bir sınır konulmalı mı, yoksa sınırsız açık finansman, yani deficit financing olarak gerçekleşebilir mi diye bir bölüm var. vergi politikası var. Geleneksel vergi politikalarıyla mı yoksa alışılmadık yeni önlemler mi gerekiyor diyor. Sanayi politikasında, sanayileşme politikasında bırakınız yapsınlar mı yoksa devletin önderliğinde bir söz konusu olacaktır diyor. Postkapitalizmle birlikte bir sanayileşme mi olacaktır diyor. Üçüncü bölümde bu kez arz yönlü olarak ele alıyor meseleleri. Yani korona sonrasında ve burada da aslında ilk olarak kurumsal yönetişimden bahsediyor. Kamu sorumluluğu ve hisseder değeri diye bir bölüm var. Finansı ele almış durumda. Bir başka bölümde, 13. bölümde kırılgan ve istikrarlı bir finans mı var? Yani böyle finansallaşmış bir dünyada böyle bir politika nasıl yürütülebilecek tartışması. Sonra endüstriyel ilişkiler ve eğitim arz yönlü olarak tabii ki sendikaların güçlendirilmesi mi, zayıflatılması mı diyor. Ve inovasyonlar var tabii ki. İnovasyonlar da çok önemli bir rol oynuyor kitabında. Radikal inovasyonlara yer verecek miyiz? Rekabet politikası var. Yani bir kusur mudur, erdem midir, ekonomik yoğunlaşma? Yani iyi bir şey midir yoksa bir piyasa başarısızlığı mıdır? İkimini ele alıyor ve 4. bölüm artık birazcık kapitalizmin uluslararası kurumlarına dönüşmüş durumda. Küresel üretim ağlarından söz ediyor. Çeşitlilikler ve yerel içerideki üretimin tamamlayıcılığını anlatıyor. Doğrudan yabancı yatırımlara yer vermiş bir bölümde teşvik midir yoksa bunlar kısıtlama mıdır tartışmasını yürütmüş. Sonra da uluslararası tahkim konusunu ele almış. Yatırımcı devlet anlaşmazlıkları bağlamında ki oldukça önemli. Ticaret politikasının korumacılık altında mı, liberalizm altında mı yürüyeceğini söylüyor. Ve fikri ve sanayi mülkiyet hakları tabii ki burada da özellikle aşılar bağlamında ele alınmış. Ve küresel sağlık yönetişiminde de hükümetler arası bir şey mi olacak, kamu özel işbirliği mi olacak yoksa kamusal önderlik biçiminde mi yürüyeceğini soruyor. Bir de dış borç tabii ki meselesi var. Dış borçları da kalıcı olarak bir silme mi yapılacak yoksa geçici hafifletme mi olacak tartışması var. 5. bölüm sanayi devrimi sonrası kapitalizm diye başlayan bölüm. Burada daha çok ekolojik etkiler, iklim değişikliği söz konusu, büyümesizlik ya da küçülme teorisi dediğimiz bir teoriye bir de burada 25. bölümde yer vermiş. Bu gereklilik midir yoksa bir hayal midir diye tartışıyor. Tarıma yer vermiş. Küresel tedarik zincirlerinin ne olduğunu aslında bize anlatmaya çalışmış burada. Ve yerel toplum desteğiyle bu nasıl tamamlanabileceğini söylüyor. Ve 6. bölümde jeoekonomik kaymalar küresel kapitalizmde diyor. Çin-ABD mücadelesi buradaki tabii ki özellikle ticaret anlaşmaları, ticaret savaşları üzerinden bunu ele almış. Bir başka bağlamda 28. bölümde Avrupa Birliği ekonomik yönetişimi bir erozyona mı uğruyor yoksa daha ileri bir entegrasyon mu tartışmasını götürmüş. Ve çok enteresan tabii ki burada bir de güvenliğin ekonomi politiğini ele almış. 29. konuda yani daha az mı güvenlik harcaması yapalım ya da güvenliğe yönelelim, daha çok mu güvenlikli olalım, korumaya yönelelim diye bir konu var. Ve son bölümü Çağdaş Kapitalizmin ideolojileri diye bir bölüm. Otoriteryen ya da demokratik kapitalizm mi olacak? Liberal ya da örgütlü organize kapitalizm mi olacak? Toplulukçu yoksa kozmopolit bir kapitalizm mi olacak diyor. Ve sonuç olarak da kapitalizmin rekabet eden vizyonları ve bakış açıları başlığı altında bir sonuç bölümü var. Şimdi bir miktar tabii uzun gibi oldu ama konunun daha iyi anlaşılabilmesi açısından iyi olduğunu düşünüyorum. En azından benim fikrim bu. Ama şunu biliyoruz, yani korona sonrasında gerçekten dünyada çok şey değişti ve değişecek de. Özetle şunu söyleyebilmek mümkün. Korona sonrasındaki dünyada öncelikli olarak yeni bir toplum anlayışına ihtiyacımız var. Bunlar benim söylediklerim tabii ki. İkincisi yeni bir demokrasi ve yeni bir devlet anlayışına ihtiyacımız var. Ve üçüncüsü de yeni bir ekonomi anlayışına ihtiyacımız var. Şimdi biz bütün bunları ben şahsen nasıl göreceğim Sayın Nölke'nin sunumunda çok faydalanacağımızdan eminim. Ben burada sözü kesiyorum, sözü kendisine bırakıyorum. Right then, Professor Nölke, it's a bit longer than I expected, but I made a brief about your book and your presentation. So it's all yours now. You may go ahead. Please begin.
Thank you very much for the detailed introduction. If you allow, I would like to share my screen for my presentation. Let me give it a try. There we are. Okay. Well, thank you very much for attending my talk in the morning. As has been explained, I will be talking about capitalism after Corona. I will talk about my book, but I will embed my book in a longer story that has unfolded also since the pandemic, because we are living in very troubled times. The year 2022 has been very violent and very special, and I would like to demonstrate some continuities between the impact of the corona pandemic, developments in this year, and also some developments in the years before. And the basic thread of my argument is that we are seeing a long-term retreat of market liberalism and a return of the state. I will do so in 4 steps. First, I will introduce you to some observations about the slow process of deglobalization or stagnation of globalization before the pandemic, which already reduced, was about to reduce the role of liberal capitalism. Then, in the main part of my presentation, I will focus on a part of my book, and I will highlight the increased importance of the state during the pandemic. And in the third part, I will then demonstrate how this has been further amplified by developments after the pandemic. And in the fourth part, we will discuss the implications and the alternatives that are on the table right now. So let me start with the process of deglobalization. I think it's not so widely known in the public that it looks like that the heydays of globalization are over. This is a process, and I'm starting here with trade globalization, trade in goods of services. And you can see that, let's say, from about 1990 to about the global financial crisis, we have seen a huge increase of the role of trade in relation to gross domestic product, in relation to the economy. And since then, this process has been reduced. We are still, let's say, in a historical perspective, on a fairly high level of globalization from this perspective, but there seems to be a long-term tendency that this liberalization of markets that was at the center of the globalization process is retreating with regard to trade of goods and services. There may be some exceptions for digital services. And this is not by coincidence, or this is not just a market process, but this is also based on political measures. Here we are looking at the trade measures that have been introduced globally, all trade measures, including both the liberalizing trade measures and the harmful trade measures, the protectionist trade measures. And again, you can see that for the last decade or so, we have an increasing number of harmful trade measures with, of course, a peak, as I will explain in a few minutes, during the pandemic, and a certain reduction afterwards. But generally, states have stopped liberalizing trade, which was the tendency over the decades before, and have now moved to a higher degree of protectionist measures. The same can be seen for foreign direct investment. Again, we have seen between, let's say, roughly around 1990 and until the global financial crisis, a strongly increasing degree of foreign direct investment flows in relation to the overall economy. But since the global financial crisis, we are on a downward slope. So the role of new FDI flows in relation to economic activity is decreasing. And again, as I will be, again, this is an indication for a weakening of liberal capitalism, of globalization, of here not only of trade, but also of foreign direct investment. The figures, of course, for individual countries, the situation can be different. And As in case of trade, we can see that this process is not by a coincidence. Also with regard to foreign direct investment, this is based on decisions taken by governments. And then again, you can see this process starting roughly around 1990. Here we are looking at the number of international investment agreements. International investment agreements are meant to support foreign direct investment. They are meant to increase, to ease foreign direct investment. And you can see starting in 1990, a huge number of new agreements. And particularly then since the global financial crisis, this has decreased quite strongly. Already before there had been a peak. And you can see in red the number of international investment agreements and have been terminated. And you can see that more recently, hardly any new investment facilitating agreements are being concluded. And we are observing on the other side an increasing number of agreements that are being terminated. So again, states are moving against international investments. They are reducing this, although again, this is different from country to country, but these are global figures. So on a global perspective, we see an increasingly restrictive policy towards these kind of investments. And this has been amplified in the pandemic and afterwards, as I will explain in a minute. So this is the long-term process that has started already before the pandemic. We have seen a period of globalization, mainly between 1990 and roughly until the global financial crisis. And since then, globalization is slowly stagnating. It's not the end of globalization. In a historical perspective, we are still on a fairly high level of globalization. But of course, if this tendency continues, we're really moving backward to more, let's say, national economies, state-centered economies. Now, during the pandemic, this process has been amplified a lot, as I will explain you in a minute. And you have been made aware already of the books that I have published a couple of months ago with Bristol University Press. And in this book, I have surveyed how the corona pandemic affects capitalism. The book is different from the other books that have been published with regard to the pandemic. I think I'm currently working on a survey article on all the books that have been looking at the relationship between the pandemic and the economy. And normally, this book have one big interpretation, what is happening, and have an idea what this does to the pandemic. And today in my talk, I will also give you one of these kinds of bigger interpretations. But the book itself is quite different. It is a very broad survey about many topics of comparative and international political economy. It introduces the core concepts of our discipline. It introduces the alternatives that our discipline has identified. And then it always asks, well, how did the pandemic affect these alternatives? In which direction is it going? What are the policy alternatives? It is written in a very simple way, I would claim, or I hope to claim. So it should be accessible for students, at least at the master's level, hopefully also on the bachelor level, and it should serve as some kind of a one-stop overview if you want to have a reference work to see how the pandemic has affected something. I hope this book can help you. Of course, this was written at an early stage. What I have done is not that I did my own research, empirical research, but what I did was that I have collected the empirical research work by other scholars in the first 2 years of the pandemic in 2020, 2021, some 300 studies, and I have evaluated these studies. Now you could argue the pandemic is not yet over, so it may be too early. However, I would say the really big measures with regard to the economy that have been introduced have largely been introduced in the first 2 years of the pandemic. And since then, we still have the health crisis with us, more or less, and of course different from country to country. But there are not so many new economic policy measures that are being introduced, let's say, in 2022. So I think the first 2 years of the pandemic give a fairly good overview of what has happened. Now, today for the presentation, I have selected a few findings. The findings of the book are very diverse. You can imagine 30 topics and always alternatives. This would be too much for a talk. Today, my focus is on one topic that is relevant for several chapters of the book, and that is the increased role of the state. So, for example, one chapter of the book deals with trade policy during the pandemic, and very clearly we see that the pandemic has further increased protectionism. I had demonstrated before that protectionism was already with us before the pandemic. The US are one of the most clear-cut examples of protectionism, particularly under the Trump government, but the Biden government is largely continuing this policy. Very interesting with regard to trade policy were export curbs. So export curbs meaning that companies were interdicted to export certain products, for example, health products to other countries. This is very unusual. Normally in trade policy, we are dealing with protectionism, so the protection against imports. Here we had trade policy with regard to exports. Normally states are supporting exports. Here they have curbed these exports. This was, of course, something in the emergency situation of the pandemic, but we can also say that these states have, let's say, found a taste for more active trade policy. And since the pandemic, we don't have this kind of general notion that trade policy always has to be about more free trade liberalization, but now governments are really looking more closely not only on imports and protect domestic companies against imports, but also on exports, particularly with regard to important goods. And I will come back to this later in the presentation when we talk about day-to-day decisions made, for example, by the US government about microchips and the like that may not be exported to China anymore. So we see an increasing role of trade. Protectionism, the state is not liberalizing anymore, but it's now scrutinizing both imports and exports. Now, the same we have seen during the pandemic for foreign direct investments, FDI. Normally, traditionally, states were quite happy about foreign direct investments because they brought in capital, they brought in expertise for domestic companies. There were, of course, some problems associated with the latter. But during the pandemic and also since the pandemic, governments have become way more critical about inward FDI, about foreign direct investments coming into their country. And the main focus of this critical perspective was on China. The background of this is that during the first years of the pandemic, 2020, 2021, China was doing much better in the pandemic than the rest of the world. Now it's exactly the other way around. Now China is suffering more. But China was quite successful with its no COVID policy. It had far more strict measures it could implement based on a rather authoritarian regime that other countries could implement. And it has a very efficient, let's say, public administration. It failed to introduce modern vaccines. This is a problem that we're seeing now. But at least in the first 2 years, China was very successful. And what China did in the first 2 years was that Chinese companies went to a shopping spree in other economies. So Chinese companies took advantage of the situation that in many other economies, companies were suffering from the pandemic and were threatened by bankruptcy and so on. And then Chinese companies started to buy companies in other economies fairly cheaply. And used, and this was seen very critically by some governments. So many governments, also the European Union, introduced screening of inward FDI. Some countries this was completely new. Before they were always happy about FDI. Now they started to critically judge foreign direct investment. And again, these are measures that have not been abolished after the pandemic, but they are with us, and we still see them on a day-to-day basis. Now, in a related way and closely linked to foreign direct investments are the global production networks that you all are familiar with, that are often based on foreign direct investments and go hand in hand with foreign direct investment. And again, we have seen a strong influence of the state and a rather restrictive influence of the state. And here we have seen since the pandemic, during the pandemic, but this continues until today. I don't think it will stop very soon. A lot of state support for the reshoring of crucial production. During the pandemic, it was clear this related to medical goods, for example, face masks, respirators, and so on. Many countries realized that they were not able to protect their population, and they realized, oh, we were producing these crucial things in the past, but now it has all been moved abroad. For example, in the United States have moved away some 90% of their mask production in 10 years to China. So now many governments are supporting companies with bringing production back onshore. So they are paying subsidies for moving this onshore. It started with medical goods, but I'm sure that you all are aware that the biggest topic at the moment in international economic policies are the huge subsidies the US government is paying for the relocation of climate-friendly technology, but also for microchip production to the US. And yesterday evening, I had the opportunity to comment on the results of the summit of the European Union. And here again, one of the biggest topics of the summit was the need to counter the US subsidies for moving production to the US. So the European Union now is considering huge subsidies itself to support European companies in these fields and to keep production in Europe, because, for example, with regard to energy prices and with regard to subsidies, the US is becoming very attractive for many European economies. And this was a big topic last night at the meeting of the heads of the governments of the European Union. Also related to this, very closely linked, is competition policy. Normally, competition policy has become more strict over the last decades. I mean, competition policy is in many countries, or a strict competition policy is fairly recent. The US, of course, have it for many years. In Germany, for example, it has been introduced only in the 1950s, that you try to police the market in order to have competition, that to avoid that certain companies are getting too big, that they are forming cartels. Cartels, for example, were really popular in Germany during the 1930s, but now they are interdicted. And during the pandemic, we have seen a very striking phenomenon, and that was a very different stance of the European Union, more specifically the European Commission, towards state aid. I mean, this is, of course, a specific problem of the European Union. I mean, in the European Union, we have a common market, and this means that we have to be very careful with state support for companies, because if state support their companies, and there are much richer states, some of the European Union, for example, takes the case of Germany, this will negatively affect companies in states that are not so rich, that are not able to support their companies. And that is why we have extremely strict competition policy in the European Union. The European Union is able to, or is able to screen each state support for a company. Very often says no towards these state measures. But during the pandemic, it allowed everything. Rich and powerful states such as Germany have made big use of this. Germany has paid in the first months of the pandemic more than 50% of state aids in the whole European Union. And since then, this is a big problem inside the European Union because, and this was also a big issue at the summit last night. The other European Union member states are now very worried that Germany is able to subsidize, to aid its companies, and their companies have a big problem if they compete with these companies. But generally, we see this in the US, we see this in the European Union, we see this in China, all around the world. The states are increasingly subsidizing their domestic companies. And again, we see a very prominent role of the state. Now, finally, another set of state involvement during the pandemic. In terms of fiscal policies, I mentioned already the financial support of companies during the pandemic, but also after the pandemic. This was unforeseen in many, at least of the Western economies. So much financial support has never been handed out for companies. This, of course, has problematical repercussions globally because not all countries on the globe are able to have this much financial support. Many countries of the global south were not able to support their companies. And this, of course, is a problem for north-south inequalities. We also have seen a revival of industrial policies. This was also something that has started already slightly before the pandemic. It was a very nicely titled paper by the International Monetary Fund, the return of a policy that may not be named, because for many decades, industrial policy, 1980s, 90s, after the millennium, this was absolutely off the table. Industrial policy was completely out. Now industrial policy is back on the agenda. It's a big issue. And now the main focus of these policies is technological sovereignty. We are now seeing, we saw during the pandemic that you have a problem if you are not able to produce certain health goods. You are in trouble if you don't are able to produce certain ingredients for your national production, for example, like microchips. And this is now being strengthened, as I will explain in a few minutes, with a big confrontation between China and the US. But the state even goes further in the field of innovation. It has started in many economies to protect crucial companies. So, for example, and that was completely unforeseen in German economic history, the German government simply bought a stake in a promising, well, today it doesn't look that promising anymore, but at that point of time, it looked extremely promising, vaccine production company, just to make sure that this company is not being sold. I think there was a US company that wanted to buy it, because there was the idea, well, we have to keep certain highly innovative companies in the country. And of course, this is something that other governments are also doing. This is not only a German thing. So again, we see a move towards protectionism and against liberalism. And we are also seeing an increasing state economies around the world. We have seen that the state has taken shares of companies to stabilize companies, for example, the air carrier in Germany, public development banks that have already increased in importance before the pandemic have become even more important. So the KfW in Germany, for example, is always getting bigger, but this is also true for other European economies. That the state is increasingly involved in the economy via its public development banks. So you see during the pandemic, comprehensively increased role of the state, supporting this tendency towards deglobalizations, towards return to the nation state. particularly during the pandemic, but many of these policies are with us anymore, and they would probably still be with us anyway, but certain developments this year have further amplified this tendency. And of course, you all know what I'm talking about, the war in Ukraine. Since the Ukraine war, many people working in the economy, in business, have really become aware of the importance of geopolitical issues. Before, very often, but of course not always, they were able to mind their business in business terms. Nowadays, I think, and you can see surveys by managers, the big tendency of this year is a big return of geopolitics, of geoeconomics. That if you have to make economic decisions, you always have to keep the geopolitical context in mind. And the Ukraine war was a war that has affected large parts of the globe, although some economies try to keep out of it, try to keep a neutral stance, but it is more or less impossible. You, in one way or the other, you are always involved in this. And of course, the big issue are the sanctions by the West and counter sanctions then on the side of Russia. And of course, this is very important for companies, because they have to make sure that their operations are in line with official policy, that they do not go against sanctions. So you have to be very careful with choosing your business partners. You have to be, sometimes it's complicated how to exercise to implement your payments, because payment systems are also under sanctions. As a company now, your traditional business decisions, where to invest, where to withdraw your investments, are getting very political. So if you, for example, as a Western company, did not withdraw from Russia, you may get under massive public pressure by NGOs, but maybe also by politicians, that you're undermining the effort to support Ukraine and so on. And we have seen this may be a process that can have very important long-term repercussions. The emergence of alternative financial infrastructures, as you probably know, before the Ukraine war, nearly all global payment informations were transmitted in the so-called SWIFT system, and since SWIFT was part of sanctions and Russian banks were forced to withdraw from SWIFT, China and Russia have strengthened their attempts to set up alternative cross-border payment system, which they already had started some years before, after the Crimea accession by Russia. This in the long term could have major repercussions, because it could erode the role of the dollar as a leading trade currency globally. So again, we see a very important role for geopolitics. And of course, the biggest topic at the moment, and this was also a big issue of the summit last night, a massive increase of state interventions in the energy sector, price caps, and the like. Now, this was the Ukraine war, but the bigger issue, I would even claim, that is forthcoming in the shadow of the Ukraine war, and I think in the long run more important, is the big China-US decoupling of their production networks. You all know that the Chinese and the US economy, let's say since 1990, have been fairly strongly integrated. Some people even talked about Chimerica. Now this process is now being reversed increasingly. It's being decoupled. Both sides are involved. China was worried, particularly after let's say the tensions between the West and Russia in the context of Crimea, that there would be some long-term difficulties, and have come up with a Made in China 2030 program, where they have brought in a lot of production into China, particularly with regard to high technologies. And in the US, there's a broad consensus between both the Republicans and the Democrats that the rise of China has to be stopped. So it is irrespective of who's the next US president, there is a clear, broad consensus on keeping China down. Of course, this is not acceptable for China. So we will have lots of tensions and probably the evolution of two global economic blocks. And we see this in these days. I mean, this is day to day. You know this from the pages of the economic newspapers. We have seen export curbs by the US on semiconductors. We have seen a curb in the US of the utilization of Chinese telecom equipment. We have seen in addition to older, huge subsidies for microchip production in the US. And of course, if China and the US, the big elephants, are moving, then other economies have to participate in one way or the other. So Japan, for example, a couple of months ago, all the major Japanese companies have come together to form a national microchip production consortium to be able to produce microchips in the country, because, of course, they are worried about what is happening to Taiwan, whether they will have further access to production of microchips from Taiwan. And of course, also in Germany, this has been a big issue. China wanted to buy part of the Hamburg harbor a couple of months ago, and after a long conflict, it was settled that China is allowed to buy a part, but a much smaller and non-controlling stake of this harbor in Hamburg. So lots of business decisions now are being seen in this US-China, or you may also say Western-China conflict. And this, I think, is a conflict that will be crucial for the world economy for certainly 1 or 2 decades. Now, what are the implications of all of these processes? And here I'm at the end of my presentations, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. What seems to be pretty sure for the moment is that we have a temporal decline of liberal capitalism and a new wave of organized capitalism. What do I mean with organized capitalism in contrast to liberal capitalism? Well, in liberal capitalism, business is business. So companies make their decisions according to their business considerations. It's all about cost and benefits. It's about shareholder value. The owners of companies are free to decide. Under organized capitalism, in contrast, they are not that free. Many decisions that companies are making now have to take into account, let's say, broader considerations, particularly, of course, political priorities, state priorities. The state is everywhere. Global geopolitical, geoeconomic concerns are everywhere. I mean, these are many of this may all not be too new for you, because in Turkey, of course, you have this process for a long term already. So this is maybe you can consider Turkey as some kind of avant-garde country with many of these processes. But of course, this is a major, let's say, global process now, and this is a process I would even argue that we have seen before. So, for example, we had already a very liberal capitalism in, let's say, around 1900s, briefly interrupted by the First World War, but capitalism was quite liberal. And then starting in the 1930s, we had already a wave towards organized capitalism, first in the war, but also with a New Deal. Also, after the Second World War, capitalism was still very organized, very national, under state control. You may be familiar with the notion of embedded liberalism. So there was a slow liberalization of economies, but it was very clear that national governments were really able to decide what is about the state. And then we had a liberalization of capitalism starting in the 1980s, and now we are moving back to a phase of organized capitalism, and maybe in the more distant future we will again move back to liberal capitalism, because organized capitalism, of course, has disadvantages. I mean, if the state is always involved in the economy, this has certain efficiency problems. People will be unhappy sometimes about these state decisions, and at some point of time there will be a call for a return to liberalism. But I would argue for the next decade or so, I think organized capitalism is with us. Now, from this perspective, democratic steering becomes very, very important, because if the state is now becoming so important, it is very important who is involved, who's making the decisions. Of course, it should be democratic, we all hope. And the state can play a rather, and here I'm talking now about, from my perspective, one of the big alternatives that are in front of us. It can be that the state plays an important role, for example, as a support for innovation. You probably all are familiar with the works of Mariana Mazzucato, who has demonstrated how important the state is for basic innovation processes, and companies later marketize these innovations. The state can be important for the stabilization of the economy, for the protection against in a crisis situation. But of course, an increased role of the state can also be a problem, because the private sector can become lazy, because it is then mainly concerned with, well, keeping good relationship with state officials, not forcing itself to be the most efficient company. It will start to involve itself in rent seeking, trying to avoid competition by having certain advantages by connections with the state. It can try to capture parts of the state by bribing people. So I think one of the big alternatives that is now in front of us, and this is the alternative I focus in my presentation today, is really the state is with us, but will it be a positive force or rather a problematic force? That is one of the big alternatives in front of us. Well, thank you for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to your comments and questions. Oops, let me stop this.
Okay, well, thank you, Andreas, for this well-designed, well-explained, and for myself, very fulfilling presentation. Thank you again. I think we still have got 15 minutes time to go. I just checked it, and we don't have any questions typed, but maybe our colleagues would like to ask questions directly if they have verbally. Would you like that?
Yes, of course. I'm fine.
Okay, let me ask them in the first place. Değerli arkadaşlarım, değerli meslektaşlarım, teşekkür ediyoruz tabii ki Profesör Nölke'ye böyle güzel bir sunum için. Benim görebildiğim kadarıyla chat box'ta herhangi bir soru yok ya da ben göremiyorum. Ama doğrudan sorularınızı sorabilirsiniz yazmadan da. Buna da hazır olduğunu söyledi. Ne dersiniz? Sorusu olan var mı? Sanırım sorusu olan yok. O zaman ben bir iki soru sorayım misafirimize. Böylece birazcık daha açıklama imkanı olsun. I understand, Andreas, our colleagues are so satisfied, so they're not going to ask any questions. But if you don't mind, I have a couple of questions to ask you. If you answer them or if you elaborate on them, I would be really, really happy.
Thank you. Yeah.
In the first place, you presentation. One is deglobalization. Is the world really deglobalized or retracting? This is the first question. But more importantly, my second question is the increasing role of the capitalist states. You said the role of the capitalist states all over the world has increased. It is true, even in Turkey, we have seen it increase. But the important question here is on what account and on whose account this increased. Would you like to be more specific on that? In other words, let me put this question in this way. Are the states becoming more democratic or more autocratic? And this is I think, crucial question about the role of the states. And immediately after, following other question is as follows. Do we still need a new world, a new society, a new democracy, a new economy? Or do we just have to be contented with the restoration of the capitalism as we had it actually in 1960s and 1970s, which is called the golden age area of capitalism? I mean, do we have to go through all this vicious circus again and again? I'd like you to comment, to have your comments on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. These are very intriguing questions, and I think, if I may, I will elaborate a bit on each of those. Let me start with the first one. Now, is it really deglobalization? I would say the best word maybe would be something like slow globalization or something. So we had a process of very strongly increasing globalization for about nearly 2 decades. Since then, this process is on a retreat, as you can see on the figures. But if you now look let's say in a very large, long-scale historical perspective, we are still living on a fairly high level of globalization. So it is not a complete return, let's say, to national economies, as we have seen, for example, during the 1930s. In the 1930s, we really had no globalization. There was a lot of talk about autarky, and each state wanted to have its own production, and trade was really very strongly reduced, and there was no talk of foreign direct investment at all. So we are not there yet, although this could still happen. But at the moment, I would say what is quite sure that at least for a couple of years, we have now a fairly substantial process of a reduction of globalization. But of course, it's still in a historical perspective, high level of globalization. Still, this is important because if you, for example, have your business model as a state or as a company based on a always increasing process of globalization, you have to think twice. You cannot operate with the same assumptions that you have had during the last decades, that globalization will continue forever, and you will always have more access to foreign markets and so on. So I think this will be important for business. Now, let me come to the second question, which is really, really crucial. It's a question about the capital state and on whose account it is operating. I think this is really the biggest challenge that we have, because that the state is more important could be a neutral issue. But the crucial issue is exactly the one that you have mentioned. Would it be a democratic state or will it be an autocratic state? And I think this is really up to, and there's also one chapter in the book that deals specifically with this issue. This is, of course, up to social struggles. And I would again like to compare it with the situation of the 1930s, where we had a similar situation, a turn to organized capitalism. Now, in the US, for example, in the 1930s, we turned towards a New Deal, and we turn towards, let's say, the most, well, benign, friendly, democratic capitalism that we have seen so far. In Japan, in Germany, in Italy, but we have seen a turn to fascism in the same situation. So this is really, in a way, the same situation. Now, in both cases, the state has become more important. In the one country, it has become more democratic, more social democratic, benign, strongly supported by the unions. In the other countries, such as Germany, it has become the worst that we have seen in the history of mankind. So this is really, I think, a very crucial situation. I think your second question is really the most important question that we are having today. Now, on the third questions with regard to the cycles, I'm indeed a friend of looking at capitalism in terms of cycles. I really claim, but I understand that this is more an outsider perspective, that we have global cycles of capitalism. We have more liberal phases, we have more organized phases, and there are counter reactions to this. Here, my thinking is very strongly influenced by a theory which is called social structures of accumulation, that has this idea of cycles, or also by Karl Polanyi that has these ideas. I really have the impression that if we look at the last 100 years of capitalism, we can see these cycles. And I would really claim that a return, let's say, to the golden years of post-war capitalism from this perspective wouldn't be so bad. But of course, these golden years, and I've seen there's a question, were not golden for everybody, and I will come to that in a minute. And of course, during the pandemic, we also had calls for overcoming capitalism, to move towards post-capitalism, degrowth, and so on. But my impression is that this is still a very limited discourse, and I think many people still rely on the, let's say, the high productiveness of capitalism because we have so much poverty. And we should think that, for example, we have seen in the last 30, 40 years, the biggest anti-poverty program in the history of mankind. That was the integration of China into the global economy. I mean, in China, in the last 30, 40 years, more than 400 million people have moved out of absolute poverty. This is absolutely unique. And here you see the, let's say, how capitalism still can work against poverty. So I think I'm not, let's say, in the degrowth, the post-capitalism camp. I think this will have to wait still for some time. And I think that these capitalist cycles have a point. I have seen now in the chat a question. May I reply to that?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, because this is also a chapter that I'm dealing with in the book, actually in several chapters. Exactly as you're noting, the pandemic has moved us backward with regard to feminist struggles, because in many situations, in many families, in the situation of crisis, when, for example, schools were closed, who took on the additional reproductive work? These were not the men, but these were the women that withdraw from the labor market. And this will have very long-term negative repercussions for gender equality, because if you withdraw from the labor market, although even not only temporarily, of course, you lose a lot in terms of earnings, in terms of career perspective, in terms of social security payments, and so on. So here the pandemic clearly is a pandemic that has moved us backward. Also, women have been working in those sectors most negatively affected by the pandemic. I mean, the pandemic was most negatively affecting services work. And in the services sectors, be it health services, but also other kinds of services, women are over proportionally employed, whereas male employment is more in production that has not been affected that much. So again, women had to take the biggest brunt of the crisis. And I don't want even to start off, let's say, medical services and the direct health effort. So the pandemic has increased inequalities, in this case, gender inequalities, but also in societies. And again, I would argue that this contributes to this process of unhappiness with the economic situation, and the turn to the state for remedying these kind of issues. The only small hope I have is that at least the situation during the pandemic, for example, with regard to reproductive work in families, has become more well-known, and at least many men have realized how important this reproductive work is, because they were at home and they could see this work on a daily basis, and whereas before they went out to work in the morning, returned in the evening. So I hope that that there's a process of reflection now starting, where these kind of inequalities with regard to reproductive work will be changed in the long-term perspective. But this probably will still take some years. So I hope to have answered your question.
Well, thank you. It's just the right time. We have still 1 minute. Would you like to say your final words on that, or shall we just say goodbye to you?
Let me add one thought on the last question that I had forgotten, because One thing that we should not forget about the golden decades, let's say starting late 40s till mid 70s or so, these were golden decades, let's say, for the male breadwinners, for men working in production. These were not golden years from a gender perspective. I mean, from a gender perspective, you could say the years of liberalism, of neoliberalism that started in the 80s were and 90s were more positive. So if I say, well, you know, return to a more, let's say, state protection, state steering of the economy as we had in the 50s and 60s could be a welcome thing if democratically steered. From a gender perspective, I think it's really important to not move back to this period and to defend the freedoms that we have or that you have been fighting for during the last decades. Thank you.
Well, thank you again, Professor Nölke, and for joining us today and for your excellent presentation, and hope to meet you again then. Bye-bye.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Değerli arkadaşlarım, meslektaşlarım, bu güzel sunuş için bir kez daha teşekkür edelim. Profesör Nölke'ye katılımınız için ve sorular için de çok teşekkür ediyorum. Sabrınız için de çok teşekkür ediyorum. Evet, Orhan, söz sende şu anda.
Hocam öncelikle ben de size bu sunuşu modere ettiğiniz için çok teşekkür ederiz. Ahmet Hoca bir iş olduğu için şu an katılamadı. O da teşekkürlerini iletiyor size. Yani tabii Nölke'nin perspektifini dinlemek güzel oldu. Kitabı da henüz yeni çıkmış Mayıs ayında. Yani ben daha önce de zaten yayınlarını falan takip ediyordum. Burada canlı olarak dinlemek de güzel oldu. Umarım ileride yüz yüze yapacağımız kongrelerde de Türkiye'de ağırlarız kendisini diye düşünüyorum. Evet, tekrar herkese teşekkürler dinlediğiniz için.
Hoşça kalın.
Size de görüşürüz hocam.